The Second World War was infamous for its brutality and large-scale industrial warfare. Being a global conflict, there were many instances of huge battles that resulted in horrendous casualties for the belligerents. You probably ask yourself, which were the most brutal clashes of the Second World War? Well, in the following minutes, you'll find out everything there is to know about the bloodiest battles fought during World War II. Number 5. The Battle of Kursk. It's the summer of 1943. After being stopped at the gates of Moscow in 1941, the German army was also pushed back from Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Successive Soviet offensives, codenamed Uranus and Saturn, pushed the Wehrmacht back hundreds of kilometers. In later engagements, during the first part of 1943, the front line stabilized, and a large bulge was formed around the city of Kursk. Desperate to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front, Adolf Hitler and the German High Command planned their summer offensive, a pincer attack, designed to envelop the salient at Kursk and encircle large numbers of Soviet soldiers. But, in the summer of 1943, the German army had much fewer resources than in the previous years. After 2 years of warfare on the Eastern Front, manpower and equipment shortages started to become more pressing, and the Wehrmacht had to manage with what it had at its disposal. While many generals insisted on attacking straight away, in the spring of 1943, Hitler was adamant. The offensive would only begin after significant numbers of the new Tiger I and Panther tanks would be produced and brought to the front lines. On the other side, benefiting from decrypted communications, the Soviets knew what was coming, and they thoroughly prepared to weather the German storm of fire and steel. The Red Army built multiple defense lines, laid out hundreds of square kilometers of minefields, and prepared a strategic reserve to counter a potential German breakthrough. Needless to say, the German army was at a significant disadvantage. The Soviets had twice more men, twice more tanks, and 3 times more guns. Nevertheless, Hitler went ahead and authorized the operation. On the 5th of July, 1943, Operation Citadel began. Led by the elite 2nd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Paul Hauser, the Southern Pincer advanced steadily, clearing a way through the dense minefields and slowly but surely eliminating Soviet strongpoints. In the north, the advance was much slower as fewer troops were available. Also, Walther Model, the commander of the forces in the north, had a bad opinion about the offensive and avoided committing all of his available forces. The day of the 5th of July proved to be the costliest day in the history of aerial warfare, as the German advance was heavily dependent on air support. In the following days, the advance in the north stalled, while in the south, a breakthrough was finally achieved, which was met by a fierce Soviet counterattack at the Battle of Prokhorovka, one of the largest armored engagements in history. On the 12th of July, only a week after the beginning of the offensive, Hitler canceled the operation. A few days prior, the Allies had landed in Sicily, and the troops fighting at Kursk were desperately needed there. But the Germans severely underestimated the strength of Soviet reserves. As the Wehrmacht's offensive was canceled, the Red Army launched its own attack, which would end up pushing the German army back hundreds of kilometers and severely damaging most of the German divisions, losses which the Wehrmacht could not sustain. In all, there were around 400,000 German casualties during the Battle of Kursk, as well as 1,000 armored vehicles and 700 aircraft lost. On the other side, the Soviets had more than 800,000 combat casualties, also losing 4,000 armored vehicles and 2,000 aircraft. Some shocking numbers considering the Red Army was on the defensive. Nevertheless, these enormous losses make the Battle of Kursk fully deserve its 5th place on this list. But the next ones were even costlier in terms of human lives lost. Number 4. The Rzhev meat grinder. It's the cold winter of 1941-1942. As the exhausted German army reached the gates of Moscow, a fierce Soviet counterattack starts pushing the hungry and freezing Wehrmacht back. By January 1942, a bulge was formed along the front line in the direction of the Soviet capital, which became known as the Rzhev-Vyazma salient. Strategically important for the German Army Group Center, due to the threat it posed on Moscow, it was heavily fortified and strongly defended. From the beginning of 1942 to March 1943, the area around Rzhev witnessed some of the most bloody fighting in the entire Eastern Front campaign. While the Germans struggled to improve their front-line position and encircle small parts of the Red Army, the Soviets repeatedly tried to eliminate the salient, without much success. Therefore, a stalemate emerged, in which both sides committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers in order to achieve their goals. The terrain, characterized by marshes, forests, and numerous rivers, made the fighting even more difficult and contributed to the high casualty rates. Despite repeated attempts by both sides to gain the upper hand, the front lines around Rzhev remained relatively stable throughout most of the battles. However, the Soviet forces managed to launch somewhat successful offensives in late 1942 and early 1943, which eventually led to the retreat of German forces from the area during Operation Buffel. As such, the Germans shortened the front line by 370 kilometers, releasing 21 divisions from the front line pressure. Still, both sides sustained many casualties during the battles around Rzhev. More than 600,000 Germans and about 1.5 million Soviet soldiers. There are reports saying that German machine gunners had mental breakdowns from the amount of people they were killing. This is the reason why the area around Rzhev became known as the Rzhev meat grinder. Number 3. The First Battle of Kiev. It's the summer of 1941. The German army is at the height of its power, following victorious campaigns in Poland, Scandinavia, France, and in the Balkans. Hitler now turned his attention east, towards Nazi Germany's greatest enemy, the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June, Operation Barbarossa commenced, the largest land offensive in history. With its trademark blitzkrieg tactics, the Wehrmacht quickly advanced into the Soviet Union, encircling large numbers of Soviet soldiers along the way. In early July, the Germans reached the approaches to Kiev, one of the most important cities in the entire Soviet Union. As a result, Stalin ordered Mikhail Kirponos, the commander of the Southwestern Front, to hold his ground at all costs, sending significant reinforcements to the Ukrainian capital. Soviet defenses appeared to withstand the initial German assault, and even counterattacked in some places. But, as August rolled on, the front line in the north quickly advanced towards Moscow, and the Soviet forces at Kiev were considered to be a significant threat to the flank of German Army Group Center. Therefore, Hitler ordered General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Corps to turn south and advance into the Soviet rear at Kiev. Simultaneously, another pincer would come from the south, crossing the Dnieper River. By the end of August, the German forces destroyed what opposition they encountered and crossed the Dnieper. Both pincers advanced rapidly and met on the 14th of September, completely encircling the Soviet Southwestern Front. More than 600,000 Red Army soldiers were now trapped, making this the largest encirclement in military history. The Soviets attempted to withdraw while they still had the chance, but Stalin's approval came too late, and a disaster was now in the making. Red Army commanders coordinated several breakout attempts. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, as the Germans had established strong defensive positions and air supremacy over the area. As the situation grew increasingly desperate for the trapped Soviet forces, the Soviet leadership faced a difficult decision. Ultimately, they ordered the remaining Red Army troops to attempt to break out, individually or in small groups, and evade capture. Many soldiers were either killed or captured by the Germans during these attempts. By the beginning of October, the Germans managed to destroy what was left of the Red Army inside the cauldron. 43 Red Army divisions were annihilated, with more than 700,000 casualties for the Soviets. In comparison, the Germans suffered just about 100,000 casualties, most of whom were lightly wounded soldiers. After capturing Kiev and most of Ukraine, the German army was now ready for an attack on Moscow, while the Soviets hurriedly attempted to plug the 200-kilometer-long gap that appeared in their front line, as the Southwestern Front was utterly destroyed. But, shockingly, The battles described can't even compare to the ones we are about to relate. These were the most brutal engagements of the Second World War, and some of the deadliest in recorded human history. Number 2. The Siege of Leningrad. As Operation Barbarossa was in full swing, Hitler set the invasion goals as the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line. For this, it was of the utmost importance for the German army to occupy the city of Leningrad. With its strategic position on the southern end of the Karelian Isthmus, it controlled access to the Gulf of Finland and to Lake Ladoga. Also, Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, held a major Soviet naval base. Moreover, the city had a significant political importance. It was the birthplace of the Communist Revolution of 1917, and, as its name suggests, it was the city of Lenin. Therefore, German Army Group North's main objective was Leningrad. During the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht rapidly advanced through the Baltic states towards the city. Along with the Finnish army, who joined the Axis invasion of the USSR, Leningrad was coming under pressure from both north and south. By the 8th of September 1941, the Axis forces had cut land-based access to the city, effectively laying siege to it. At this moment, Adolf Hitler was so confident of capturing Leningrad that he had invitations printed for the victory celebrations, which were to be held in the city's Hotel Astoria. But the Nazis' intentions regarding Leningrad were much more inhumane. Although various theories have been put forward about Germany's plans for Leningrad, Hitler intended to utterly destroy the city and its population. The following is a directive sent by Hitler to Army Group North on September 29th.
After the defeat of Soviet Russia, there can be no interest in the continued existence of this large urban center. Following the city's encirclement, requests for surrender negotiations shall be denied, since the problem of relocating and feeding the population cannot and should not be solved by us. In this war for our very existence, we can have no interest in maintaining even a part of this very large urban population.
Nevertheless, it would not be that easy for the German army. The Soviet forces trapped in Leningrad fought ferociously, and the Wehrmacht didn't have enough divisions to storm the city directly or even completely encircle the city, cutting it off from Lake Ladoga. Later, this would prove to be a vital chance for the Soviets. Through Lake Ladoga, the Red Army brought supplies and reinforcements, but these were not nearly enough for the 3 million residents of Leningrad. Civilians in the city suffered from extreme starvation, especially in the winter of 1941-42. From November 1941 to February 1942, the only food available to the citizens was 125 grams of bread per day, of which 50% consisted of sawdust and other inedible admixtures. In conditions of extreme temperatures, down to -30 degrees Celsius, even a distance of a few kilometers to a food distribution point created an insurmountable obstacle for many inhabitants. In that period, people often died on the streets, and Leningrad's residents soon became accustomed to the sight of death. In January and February 1942, 200,000 people died, mostly from starvation. Despite the dire situation, the defenders of Leningrad, including the civilian population, displayed remarkable resilience and determination. The city's defenses were bolstered with anti-aircraft batteries, trenches, and other fortifications. Civilians helped prepare defensive positions and establish obstacles, knowing this was a battle against extermination. Simultaneously, during the winter months, the Road of Life was established, a fortified supply route across the frozen Lake Ladoga through which food, fuel, and ammunition were transported into the besieged city under constant threat of enemy artillery and air attacks. Truck drivers often drove their vehicles with the door open, half outside the vehicle, ready to jump at the first crack in the ice. Through 1942, the military situation did not change much. While the Germans gathered troops to finally encircle Leningrad completely during Operation Nordlicht, they were forced to use these units to stop the Soviet Sinyavino offensive, so the general situation remained the same. But, as all things do, the encirclement was finally ended. In the wake of Operation Iskra, in January 1943, the Red Army units overcame the powerful German fortifications to the south of Lake Ladoga, and on the 18th of January, the Volkov Front's 372nd Rifle Division met troops of the 123rd Rifle Brigade of the Leningrad Front, opening a 10-kilometer-wide land corridor, which provided some relief to the besieged population of Leningrad. The siege continued until the 27th of January 1944, when the Soviet Leningrad-Novgorod offensive expelled German forces from the southern outskirts of the city. This meant the end of the Siege of Leningrad, and a much-awaited relief to the seemingly endless hardships suffered by the city's residents. But the death toll was enormous. 300,000 German casualties, more than 1 million Soviet military losses, and 1 million civilian lives. This is why the Siege of Leningrad, the deadliest siege in human history, takes the second place on this list. Still, there is one more battle that eclipses all the others. Number 1. The Battle of Stalingrad. It's the summer of 1942. After being defeated at the gates of Moscow the previous winter, the German army managed to stabilize the front lines. Hitler wanted to deal a powerful blow to the Soviet Union, one that would knock it out of the war. But, as the Wehrmacht did not have the same amount of resources it had in 1941, a front-wide offensive couldn't take place. Therefore, the Germans chose a region vital for the war effort, the Caucasus. On the other side, Stalin and the Soviet High Command expected another offensive on Moscow and focused on preparing defenses and bringing all available reinforcements to the area. As such, they were shocked to find out they put all of their eggs in the wrong basket. As Germany was increasingly desperate for oil, it would strike towards one of the most oil-rich regions in the world, with the intention of capturing the oil fields at Maikop, Grozny, and Baku. This would have given the Wehrmacht the much-needed resources it lacked, and would have probably provided the necessary impetus to defeat the Soviet Union. After the capture of Sevastopol, Hitler launched his offensive, codenamed Fall Blau, on the 28th of June 1942. Army Group South was divided into Army Groups A and B. Army Group A was tasked with crossing the Caucasus Mountains to reach the Baku oil fields, while Army Group B protected its flanks along the Volga, occupying Stalingrad. The German attack surprised the Soviets and quickly brushed away any Soviet troops the Wehrmacht encountered. Seemingly, the blitzkrieg tactics worked wonders in the Kalmuk steppe, and the German army quickly advanced towards its objectives. The Soviet collapse allowed the Germans to capture the western part of Voronezh on July 6th and reach and cross the Don River near Stalingrad on the 26th of July. Nevertheless, Army Group B's approach toward Stalingrad slowed in late July and early August due to constant counterattacks by newly deployed Red Army reserves and overstretched supply lines. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army launched their offensive, with support from intensive bombing raids by the Luftwaffe, which reduced much of Stalingrad to rubble. The battle soon degenerated into house-to-house fighting, which escalated drastically as both sides continued pouring reinforcements into the city. By mid-November, the Germans had pushed the Soviet defenders back into narrow zones along the Volga's west bank. However, winter set in and conditions became particularly brutal, with temperatures often dropping tens of degrees below freezing. Nevertheless, Soviet generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky prepared a nasty surprise for the German army. While the Germans were bled dry in Stalingrad, the Red Army would provide a sudden blow in an unexpected way. On the 19th of November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a two-pronged attack targeting the Romanian divisions protecting the 6th Army's flanks. The Axis forces were overrun, and the 6th Army was encircled. Still, Adolf Hitler was determined to hold the city at all costs and forbade the 6th Army from trying a breakout. Instead, attempts were made to supply it by air and to break the encirclement from the outside. Although the Soviets were successful in preventing the Germans from making enough airdrops to the trapped Axis forces at Stalingrad, heavy fighting continued for another 2 months, while the Soviets tried to destroy the pocket. Finally, on the 2nd of February 1943, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus surrendered. Hitler had just recently promoted him to Field Marshal, as no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, essentially urging Paulus to take his life. But the German general tried to save what was left of his men, who had run out of ammunition and food. The Battle of Stalingrad was characterized by fierce close-quarters combat and direct assaults on civilians in aerial raids. It epitomized urban warfare and is recorded as the single largest and costliest urban battle in military history. All sides suffered horrendous casualties at Stalingrad. The Germans lost around 400,000 men, with another 130,000 Italian losses, 200,000 Romanian losses, and 150,000 Hungarian casualties. On the other side, the Soviets suffered even more for their victory, with more than 1.5 million combat casualties. This is why the Battle of Stalingrad was the bloodiest and fiercest battle in the entirety of World War II, and arguably in all of human history. The battle and the subsequent destruction of the German Sixth Army caused shock waves around the earth. From Winston Churchill to Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin, it was clear that the German beast could be defeated, and they would end up doing just that, only 2 years later. As a testament to the brutality and ferociousness of the combat on the Eastern Front, it can be easily noticed that the 5 bloodiest battles of the Second World War were all fought between the Axis powers and the Soviet Union. Let us remember these men's plight and honor their courage, so we won't repeat these mistakes in the future. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, tell us what surprised you the most in the comments section below. And don't forget, there are many more videos coming at Study of War.